You walk away from the conversation thinking it went well. You smiled. You asked questions. You contributed stories. Nothing awkward happened. No one argued. No one insulted you. And yet something lingers in the air afterward, something you can't quite name. Their replies felt thinner, their laughter slightly forced. They checked their phones more than usual. And later, when plans are made, your name somehow isn't mentioned. This is the cruelest form of rejection because it arrives without confrontation. No one tells you what you did wrong. They simply stop inviting you, stop sharing deeper things, stop letting you inside their real thoughts. You are left alone with confusion, replaying the conversation in your mind, searching for a moment that never seemed to exist. Here is the hard truth. Most of the time you are not being rude. You are not cruel. You are not intentionally selfish. You are simply unaware. Small conversational habits, subtle and almost invisible to you, quietly push people away. They do not create dramatic fallout. They create distance. And distance is harder to diagnose than conflict. Conflict at least gives you something to fix. Distance just leaves you guessing. Epictetus reminded us that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we may listen more than we speak. But listening is not just about silence. It is about presence. It is about setting aside the urge to perform, impress, correct, or compete. Most people do not lose connection because they lack intelligence. They lose connection because their ego quietly occupies the room before their empathy ever arrives. When someone speaks, we often believe we are listening. We nod, we maintain eye contact, we say the right phrases at the right time. But inside, we are preparing our response. We are comparing their story to ours. We are calculating what we will say next, so that we appear interesting, helpful, insightful. In doing so, we shift the center of gravity back to ourselves. The other person feels it, even if they cannot articulate it. Conversations that could have deepened into something meaningful remain suspended at the surface. Marcus Aurelius wrote constantly about self-examination, not to condemn himself, but to refine himself. He understood that growth does not begin with blaming others for distance. It begins with asking, "What role did I play?" This question requires humility. It requires the willingness to consider that perhaps the connection faded not because people are shallow or unfriendly, but because something in our presence made depth difficult. The ego does not announce itself loudly in conversation. It disguises itself as enthusiasm, as helpfulness, as intelligence, as passion. You think you are engaging, others feel overshadowed. You think you are contributing, others feel unheard. You think you are bonding, others feel subtly compared or corrected. None of this is intentional. That is what makes it dangerous. The Stoics taught that control begins internally. You cannot control whether someone likes you. You cannot force connection. But you can remove the barriers you unknowingly build. You can choose to observe yourself in conversation the way a philosopher observes his own thoughts, without defensiveness. You can notice when you rush to fill silence, when you interrupt to clarify, when you pivot a topic back toward your own experience. Each of these actions may seem harmless alone. Together they form a pattern, and patterns shape perception. If you have ever wondered why relationships stay polite but never intimate, why people are friendly but rarely confide in you, why invitations slow down over time without explanation, the answer is rarely dramatic. It is almost always subtle, a habit repeated unconsciously, a small shift in attention away from the other person and back toward yourself. Wisdom in conversation is not about speaking brilliantly. It is about creating space. It is about allowing someone else to feel seen without competition, without interruption, without quiet redirection. The wise person does not enter a conversation to prove something. They enter to understand something. This is where transformation begins, not in becoming more charming or more impressive, but in becoming more attentive. The first step is not changing your personality. It is observing it, noticing when your mind drifts toward what you will say next, instead of what is being said now, catching the impulse before it becomes a habit. Connection is not complicated. It is fragile. And most of the time it fades not because of who you are, but because of small behaviors you never questioned. In the next part, we will examine the first habit that quietly weakens connection and how to correct it with deliberate presence. Habit number 1 is deceptively simple, and almost everyone does it. You wait for your turn to talk instead of actually listening. On the surface, it looks like engagement. You nod, you lean forward, you say yeah at the right moments. But inside your mind, something else is happening. You are not absorbing their words. You are constructing your reply. You are searching your memory for a similar story. You are preparing a point that sounds insightful. The conversation becomes less about understanding and more about timing. You are waiting for the pause so you can enter. The other person feels it, even if they cannot name it. There is a subtle difference between being heard and being processed. When someone truly listens, you feel space around your words. When someone is waiting to speak, you feel pressure. The rhythm changes. You sense that your sentence is simply a bridge to their next performance. Over time, this creates exhaustion. People begin to shorten their stories around you. They stop sharing complex thoughts. They stay at the surface because depth requires patience, and they have learned you are already halfway to your own reply. Epictetus did not praise silence for its own sake. He praised intentional silence. Listening was not passive. It was active attention. It required humility. It required setting aside the belief that your contribution must always follow immediately. Most people believe conversation is a balance of speaking and listening. The Stoics understood something deeper. Conversation is an act of service. When someone speaks, your role is not to prepare your brilliance. Your role is to receive their experience fully. Consider how often you interrupt the natural flow by mentally comparing. Someone shares a difficult week at work. Instead of feeling their frustration, you search for your own harder week. Someone talks about a trip they enjoyed. Instead of entering their excitement, you recall your own travel story that might be more interesting. You think you are bonding, but comparison shifts the spotlight. Even if you do not speak it aloud, the energy changes. You are no longer with them, you are with yourself. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called disciplined perception. He trained his mind to see events clearly without adding ego. In conversation, disciplined perception means hearing what is being said without immediately attaching your identity to it. It means resisting the urge to make every topic intersect with your narrative. True listening requires surrendering the need to be central. That surrender is uncomfortable for the ego, but it is essential for connection. A simple practice can change everything. When someone finishes speaking, pause for 2 full seconds before responding. Do not fill the silence. Let it breathe. That pause signals consideration. It proves you are digesting, not rehearsing. Then respond to what they actually said, not what it triggered in you. Ask a follow-up question that deepens their experience instead of replacing it. For example, instead of saying, "That reminds me of when I," try asking, "What part of that was hardest for you?" Or, "How did that make you feel?" This small shift transforms the atmosphere. People relax, they lean in, they share more because they sense that their words are not competing with yours. You are not waiting to perform, you are present. And presence is rare enough that when someone experiences it, they remember it. Listening is not weakness, it is discipline. It is restraint, it is strength held quietly. When you truly listen, you do not disappear, you become trusted. And trust is the foundation of every meaningful relationship. In the next part, we will examine the second habit that quietly damages connection, turning every story into a competition without realizing you are doing it. Habit number 2 is subtle, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You one-up every story. Someone shares something meaningful, and before the weight of their words has settled, you respond with a bigger, harder, more impressive version of your own. They describe a stressful week. You had a worse one. They mention a delayed flight. Yours was longer. They celebrate a small victory. You top it with a larger achievement. You believe you are relating. They experience it as being replaced. This habit is rarely malicious. It usually comes from a desire to connect. We think shared experience equals closeness. But connection does not require escalation. When someone opens up, they are not inviting competition. They are inviting recognition. When you immediately elevate your own story above theirs, you unintentionally diminish their moment. The focus shifts. Their experience becomes a stepping stone for yours. Over time, this pattern erodes trust. People begin to censor themselves around you. They hesitate before sharing good news because they know it will be overshadowed. They hesitate before sharing struggles because they know it will be minimized by comparison. It is not that they resent you, it is that they feel unseen. Conversation becomes exhausting because every sentence risks being outperformed. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that another person's success does not reduce his own. The ego, however, fears irrelevance. It wants proof that you matter. One-upping is the ego's attempt to secure status in the conversation. It says, "Notice me too, validate me too." But strength does not need to compete. True confidence allows someone else's experience to stand alone without threatening your own. There is a quiet power in restraint. When someone shares an achievement, celebrate it without adding your version. When someone shares a difficulty, validate it without escalating the scale. Let their story breathe. You can still relate later, but first give their experience full weight. A useful discipline is this: when someone shares something personal, ask at least one clarifying or empathetic question before referencing yourself. What was that like for you? How did you handle that? What are you most proud of about it? This small delay prevents automatic comparison. It keeps the spotlight where it belongs. The Stoics believed that ego is the root of unnecessary conflict. In conversation, ego often disguises itself as enthusiasm, but enthusiasm that constantly redirects attention becomes suffocation. If every exchange becomes a subtle contest, people will withdraw, not dramatically, quietly. Let others have their moment fully. Let their struggle exist without scale. Let their victory remain theirs. When you remove competition from conversation, something remarkable happens. People feel safe sharing again. They no longer brace for comparison. They feel respected. And respect is remembered long after the details of any story fade. In the next part, we will examine the third habit that quietly pushes people away offering advice when what they truly needed was understanding. Habit number 3 feels helpful. It feels intelligent. It even feels generous. You give unsolicited advice. Someone shares a struggle, and before they have finished explaining it, you are already solving it. You suggest strategies, outline steps, offer fixes. In your mind, you are being supportive. In their experience, you have just skipped the part they needed most. Most people do not share problems because they lack solutions. They share because they need understanding. They want their emotions acknowledged before their situation is analyzed. When you immediately move to advice, you unintentionally communicate that their feelings are secondary to efficiency. The conversation shifts from connection to correction. Over time, this creates distance. People stop bringing you anything vulnerable. They keep their struggles private because they know the moment they open up, they will receive instructions instead of empathy. Advice, even when correct, can feel like dismissal if it arrives too quickly. Epictetus taught that wisdom begins with understanding what is within your control. You cannot control another person's emotional process. You cannot rush them into clarity. Sometimes the most disciplined response is restraint. To sit with someone's difficulty without attempting to remove it. To let their experience exist without reorganizing it. The impulse to fix often comes from discomfort. We do not like watching someone we care about feel pain, so we attempt to repair it immediately. But that discomfort belongs to us. When we rush to advice, we are soothing ourselves more than helping them. There is a powerful alternative. Before offering any solution, ask one simple question: do you want advice or do you just need someone to listen? That question alone transforms the dynamic. It shows respect. It places control back in their hands. It acknowledges that support is not one size fits all. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of measured speech. Not every thought requires expression. Not every solution requires delivery. True strength includes knowing when silence serves better than strategy. When someone shares something difficult, try staying in empathy longer than feels comfortable. Reflect what you heard. That sounds exhausting. I can see why that hurt. That must feel overwhelming. These statements do not fix the problem, but they strengthen the relationship. Advice has value, but timing determines whether it. When you learn to wait to assess what is truly needed, conversations deepen. People begin to feel safe around you because they know you will not treat their vulnerability as a puzzle to solve. The next habit goes even deeper. It does not just skip empathy, it subtly shifts every conversation back to you. Habit number 4 is quieter but just as damaging. You bring every topic back to yourself. Someone shares an idea, a plan, a concern, and within moments the focus shifts. Not because you intended to dominate the conversation, but because you instinctively relate everything to your own experience. They mention changing careers, and suddenly you are recounting your professional journey. They talk about a book, and it becomes a summary of your reading history. Every thread they introduce becomes material for your narrative. You believe you are connecting. They feel overshadowed. Conversation is not a stage. It is not a platform to demonstrate relevance. When every subject loops back to you, the other person begins to feel like a supporting character in your story rather than an equal participant in a shared exchange. Over time, they offer less. They simplify their contributions. They avoid depth because depth invites a monologue. This pattern rarely comes from arrogance. It comes from ego's subtle desire to stay central. The mind constantly searches for ways to insert itself. Marcus Aurelius warned himself daily about this impulse. He reminded himself to observe more than perform, to understand more than display. He knew that wisdom grows in attention, not in dominance. When someone introduces a topic, stay with their thread longer than feels natural. Ask about their perspective before offering yours. If you share a related experience, keep it brief and then return the focus. The goal is balance, not silence. The goal is mutual presence. A simple internal check can shift everything. Am I adding to this conversation or redirecting it? Am I illuminating their idea or replacing it with mine? True confidence does not need to center itself. It is comfortable allowing someone else to hold the spotlight. In fact, it recognizes that giving attention often strengthens connection more than receiving it. When people feel seen, they open. When they feel overshadowed, they withdraw quietly. The next habit pushes people away even faster. It interrupts not just topics but voices themselves. Habit number 5 is interruption. You cut people off mid-sentence. You finish their thoughts before they finish forming them. You jump in because you think you understand where they're going. You believe you're being efficient, engaged, maybe even helpful. But what they feel is dismissal. Every interruption sends a silent message. My words matter more than yours. My pace is more important than your process. Some people speak quickly. Others need time. Some pause to search for the right word. Others build ideas slowly, layer by layer. When you interrupt, you collapse that process. You replace their unfolding thought with your assumption of it. And even if your guess is accurate, accuracy is not respect. Seneca wrote about patience as a form of strength. He believed impatience revealed a restless ego. When silence makes you uncomfortable, you rush to fill it. But silence is not empty. It is space. And space is what allows people to feel safe enough to continue. In relationships, repeated interruption slowly trains people to shrink. They shorten their stories. They simplify their thoughts. They avoid complexity because complexity takes time, and time feels unsafe around someone who constantly overrides them. A simple practice can change this entirely. When someone finishes speaking, wait 2 full seconds before responding. Let the silence exist. Let their words land. Often they are not finished. Often something deeper comes after that pause. Interruption is rarely about rudeness. It is about control. The ego wants to guide the flow. But connection is not control. It is cooperation. When you allow someone to complete their thought fully, you are not just being polite, you are affirming their existence in the moment. You are saying without words, you matter enough for me to wait. And the next habit may be even more subtle. It keeps conversations safe, polite, and completely empty. Habit number 6 is staying on the surface. You ask how someone is. They say, fine. You ask how work is. They say, busy. You ask if they enjoyed their weekend. They say, yes. The exchange is polite. It is functional, and it builds nothing. Surface questions produce surface answers, and surface answers cannot carry connection. Most people believe they are showing interest simply by asking something. But interest is not measured by the question. It is measured by the depth of curiosity behind it. When you only ask for facts, you only receive facts. You never reach the internal world where real connection lives. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to look beyond appearances, beyond roles, beyond titles. He practiced seeing the human being underneath the surface. Conversations require the same discipline. Instead of asking what someone did, ask what it meant to them. Instead of asking how something went, ask what surprised them about it. Instead of asking what they are doing next, ask what they are hoping for. Depth is invited, not forced. And most people are quietly waiting for permission to share something real. When you consistently stay shallow, people learn that you are not a place for vulnerability. Not because you are unsafe, but because you never open the door. They stop offering deeper pieces of themselves. The relationship stabilizes at politeness and never evolves beyond it. The Stoics understood that meaningful relationships require courage. It takes courage to ask a deeper question. It takes courage to hold space for an honest answer. Surface conversations protect you from discomfort, but they also protect you from connection. Replace status questions with experience questions. Ask what something felt like. Ask what someone learned. Ask what challenged them. And then listen. When you consistently create space for depth, people begin to trust you with it. And the final habit is the one that quietly erodes trust faster than anything else. Once this is broken, connection rarely returns. PHBN 8. Habit number 7 is turning every conversation into a debate. Someone shares an opinion, you correct it. Someone expresses excitement about something, you point out the flaws. Someone offers a perspective, you counter it immediately. You believe you are being intelligent, analytical, sharp. They experience you as exhausting. Not every thought requires challenge. Not every idea needs refinement. Not every statement is an invitation to intellectual combat. When people begin to feel that anything they say will be examined, corrected, or dismantled, they stop offering anything meaningful. They retreat to safe topics. They choose neutral statements. They protect themselves from being scrutinized. You think you are stimulating discussion. They feel like they are defending themselves. Epictetus taught that it is not necessary to have an opinion about everything. The wise person knows when silence preserves peace. He understood that being correct is not always the highest good. Sometimes preserving harmony is greater than proving a point. Ask yourself before challenging someone, is this correction necessary? Will it strengthen the relationship? Or am I satisfying my need to feel superior? The Stoic path values discernment. There is a time for debate. There is a time for connection. Wisdom is knowing the difference. And the final habit, the most damaging one, is breaking trust. Habit number 8 is sharing what was told to you in confidence. Someone opens up about a private struggle. You repeat it to someone else. Maybe casually, maybe with concern, maybe without realizing the damage. But the moment it leaves your mouth, something sacred is broken. Trust is not a small thing. It is the foundation beneath every meaningful relationship. When someone confides in you, they are offering vulnerability. That vulnerability is not yours to distribute. Marcus Aurelius wrote about integrity as alignment between action and character. When you protect someone's confidence, you strengthen your character. When you violate it, you weaken it. Once trust is broken, apologies rarely restore it. The person who confided in you will never again feel entirely safe. They will filter themselves. They will hold back. The connection will cool. Guard what people entrust to you. If you are unsure whether something is private, assume it is. Silence preserves dignity. These 8 habits are not proof that you are flawed beyond repair. They are signs of unconscious patterns. Most people carry several of them without realizing the quiet damage they cause. The difference between someone who builds deep connection and someone who remains on the outside is awareness. The Stoics practiced daily reflection, not to shame themselves, but to refine themselves. You do not need to correct everything at once. Choose one habit, observe it, interrupt it, replace it. Small adjustments create profound shifts. Connection is not about becoming charming. It is about removing the behaviors that quietly push people away. Now you see them.